In 1324, a man walked into Cairo with so much gold that he destroyed the Egyptian economy. Not by stealing, not by conquering, by giving it away. He handed out gold so generously to strangers, to beggars, to the streets, that the price of gold collapsed across North Africa and the Middle East for the next 12 years. Egypt, the most powerful state on the continent, was brought to its knees by one man's generosity. His name was Mansa Musa, and he was, by any measure we have, the richest human being who has ever lived. Not Elon Musk, not Rockefeller, not Augustus Caesar, him. A 14th century West African king that most history books treat as a footnote. Here's what I want to understand today. How did a man become so wealthy that his spending money could wreck a superpower? How did he build an empire that controlled half the world's gold? And why, despite being the most famous person on the planet in his time, did we almost completely forget he existed? Because the answer to that last question might be the most important part of the story. To understand Mansa Musa, you need to understand what Mali was. By the early 14th century, the Mali Empire was not some remote African kingdom. It was a geopolitical superpower. It stretched from the Atlantic coast, where modern Senegal sits, all the way east to modern-day Niger, roughly the size of Western Europe, and underneath it sat something the rest of the world desperately needed: gold. At the time, roughly half of all the gold circulating in the entire Old World, Europe, the Middle East, Asia, came from West Africa, from mines controlled by one empire, Mali's mines. Mansa Musa's mines. Here's what that means in practice. Every gold coin in medieval Europe, every piece of jewelry in Cairo, every payment made between merchants in Genoa or Venice, it all traced back, at some point, to Mansa Musa's land. He didn't just sit on gold. He was the source of gold. Mansa Musa came to power in 1312, and the story of how he became king is almost as strange as everything that follows. His predecessor, King Abu Bakr II, had a theory. He believed the Atlantic Ocean had an end, a shore on the other side, and he was determined to find it. So in 1311, he built 2,000 ships. 2,000. He loaded them with men, supplies, and provisions for years, and he sailed west. None of them ever came back. Abu Bakr II disappeared into the Atlantic Ocean 6 years before Columbus was even born. Some historians call him the first person to attempt a transatlantic crossing. He was never seen again, and so, almost by accident, Mansa Musa inherited the throne of the richest empire on earth. We'll come back to what happened to Abu Bakr, because what he left behind might explain something about Mansa Musa that no one talks about. In 1324, Mansa Musa decided to make the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage to Mecca. Every devout Muslim is called to make it once in a lifetime. Mansa Musa made it like no one before him and no one since. He assembled a caravan of 60,000 people. Let that number sit for a second. 60,000 people, walking across the Sahara Desert, among them 12,000 personal servants, each dressed in Persian silk and brocade. 500 servants walked directly before him, each carrying a golden staff. 80 camels, each loaded with 300 pounds of pure gold dust. The caravan took an entire day to pass. He built a new mosque every Friday of the journey, and he gave away gold everywhere he stopped. When he arrived in Cairo, the Sultan of Egypt, one of the most powerful rulers on the planet, came to greet him. Mansa Musa refused to bow, not out of arrogance, but because, as a devout Muslim, he said he bowed only to God. The Sultan of Egypt, used to every king in the world prostrating before him, had to accept it, and reportedly became Mansa Musa's friend. The Egyptian historian Al-Umari visited Cairo 12 years after that visit. People were still talking about it. 12 years later, that's not a visit. That's a seismic event. Quick pause. If this history is blowing your mind, subscribe. Seriously, this video took weeks of research. And the next one? A whole civilization wiped off the map. Not by war, not by disease, by the weather. Hit subscribe and make sure you're there when it drops. Now, here's where the story gets complicated. Everything I've told you so far is the version that made Mansa Musa famous. The gold. the generosity, the pilgrimage, the greatest wealth the world had ever seen. But here's what historians debate much more quietly. Did Mansa Musa's Hajj actually damage his own empire? Think about it. He gave away so much gold in Cairo and Mecca that the metal's value collapsed for over a decade. Not just in Egypt, across all of North Africa and into the Middle East, gold was Mali's entire economy. The mines, the trade routes, the taxes on gold, all of it denominated in a metal that was suddenly worth a fraction of what it had been. When he came home, Mali was still enormous, still powerful, but the economic shockwaves he'd created didn't stop, and within a generation, the cracks started to show. The man who gave away the most gold in human history may have accidentally begun the slow collapse of the empire it came from. Greatness and ruin. Same action, same moment, but let's not end on the collapse. Because what Mansa Musa built deserves its own chapter. When he returned from Mecca, he brought back a Spanish architect named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. He had met him in Mecca. They became close. And Mansa Musa commissioned him to redesign Timbuktu. What they built together was extraordinary. The Jinguaraber Mosque, which still stands today, schools, libraries, and what would become Sankore University, one of the great intellectual centers of the medieval world, housing up to 1 million manuscripts. 1 million manuscripts. In 14th century West Africa, while Europe was still deep in the Middle Ages, feudal, plague-ridden, largely illiterate outside the church, Timbuktu was a city of scholars, astronomers, lawyers, poets, and mathematicians. Students came from across Africa, from the Middle East, from Spain, to study. In Mali, this is why Mansa Musa couldn't be forgotten. Not just because of the gold, because he built something that outlasted the gold. The mosques, the universities, the manuscripts. Some of those manuscripts survived. They're in archives today. They prove that what happened in Mali in the 14th century was not a footnote. It was a civilization. Now, back to Abu Bakr VI, the king who sailed into the Atlantic and never came back. Some researchers have looked at this story and asked a question that nobody really wants to answer. What if he made it? There are accounts, unverified, contested, of pre-Columbian contact between West Africa and the Americas. Traces in linguistics, in plants, and coastal legends. Nothing proven. But the question doesn't go away. And here's why it matters for Mansa Musa's story. Mansa Musa inherited a kingdom from a man who believed in pushing beyond the known world, who looked at the horizon and sailed toward it. And Mansa Musa, rather than doing the same, turned inward. He made his kingdom magnificent. He built, he studied, he prayed. Maybe that was wisdom. Maybe it was the reason the empire eventually weakened, because it stopped expanding and started perfecting. Don't know, but I find it extraordinary that the richest man in history came to power, because his predecessor disappeared chasing a horizon, and that he spent his entire reign making the place he inherited more beautiful than he found it. Mansa Musa died sometime between 1332 and 1337. The exact date is unknown. Within 50 years, the Mali Empire had begun to fragment. Within 200 years, it was gone. The man who was so rich he broke the Egyptian economy, who built universities in the desert, who refused to bow before a sultan, who was drawn on European maps as a king holding a golden orb, surrounded by the legend, the most rich and noble lord of all this region, by the abundance of gold that is gathered in his land. That man, for centuries, barely appeared in Western history books, and that, maybe, is the real story. Not the gold, not the pilgrimage, but the fact that one of the most powerful, sophisticated, wealthy civilizations in human history was systematically erased from the story we tell ourselves about the world. The question isn't just, who was Mansa Musa? The question is, what else are we not being told? And that question leads directly to the next video, because there is a civilization even older than Mali, one that was considered the most advanced society on Earth in its time, a civilization that didn't fall to war, didn't fall to invasion. It was killed by the weather, the Akkadian Empire. 2200 BC, the first recorded climate collapse in human history. And what happened then? Looks uncomfortably familiar to what's happening now. That video drops next. Make sure you don't miss it.